right, thanks for having me. So I serve as fish and wildlife biologist at Kenai National Wildlife Refuge on the Kenai Peninsula. I'm going to start with a poem. Earthworms in the land of the midnight sun. Anglers toss on the ground when their fishing is done. Set free, they disperse peristaltically. Change the woods in time irreversibly. Some worms, some days, do end up in a lake where salmonids gladly of them partake. But for salmon, what are their biggest effects? Well, their biggest effects are probably indirect. So now I'll get on with my presentation for real. Let's see, how do I share a screen? Share screen. Thanks. All right. Here we are. So in this work, my collaborators are Kyung-Soo Yu and Adrian Wackett of the University of Minnesota. And they have been looking into the ecology of earthworms in Europe and the Midwest and Alaska over the last few years. So this is, just to show you, a worm is a red marsh worm, an invasive worm that's common on the southern Kenai Peninsula. Okay, and this is all I have for justification. This is it. What I want is salmon to be here for my children and their children. So in past presentations, I've covered biogeography of earthworms in Alaska, how they're changing our forests, and what we might do about them. Today, I'm going to focus on what we know about how earthworms might affect salmon. Now I'm going to give you the end before the beginning. This is pretty much where I will end up in a few minutes. W. Percy Wickett studied diets of young coho salmon in British Columbia in the 1960s, where he found that the salmon were eating earthworms. He took the next step of determining that the earthworms were non-native and thinking about what this might mean. Just based on the fact that earthworms change soils, Wickett inferred that the changes brought about by earthworms over the whole landscape are likely to affect streams. Now, I'm just going to flesh out his conclusion today with a little more information. But first, a little background. The important point here is that in Alaska, the overwhelming majority of the landscape is free of the earthworm species that can change our forests the most, and it will stay that way for a long time. This is because earthworms really do not get around very well on their own. It could take them hundreds of years, for example, just to get around the shore of a lake at 30 feet per year. The way that these worms get around out to remote locations is through fishermen like this fisher girl. Quiz time. This, just for background, this is a piece of forest floor under birches and alders on the Kenai Refuge in mid-September. What's wrong here? You think about that for a minute. I'll give you a second. Answer, there are no leaves. The leaf litter and humus have been completely removed. Only the most recently fallen leaves remain. The ground surface is now made of worm castings and coarse woody material. What do you think are the consequences of these changes? I'll give you a second. Now look at this. This is the base of an aspen tree in an aspen forest. What do you see wrong here? I'll give you another second to look at it. The answer is that those roots grew in a thick layer of organic matter that is gone. It was completely consumed as the front of invading earthworms worked its way through. Look at the moss line. Some moss is starting to grow downward, but you can see where the moss used to end and leaf litter began. Well, this is an earthworm it's an earthworm invasion transect in the forest along the lakeshore. It's Stormy Lake on the Kenai Peninsula, demonstrating what happens in about 20 years. Here, the density of earthworms was amazing, reaching 1,300 pounds per acre. We had to double check our math on that one. Compare that to moose at about 1,000 pounds per 100 to 200,000 acres in Alaska, or 100 to 20,000 times less than the amount of earthworms here. With so much biomass, it's no wonder that the worms changed things. They were happy there. So in this talk, I'm not going to cover the details about what this means for terrestrial systems, but I will summarize. First, earthworms drastically alter nutrient cycling. Second, changes in the soil and the fact that earthworms eat seeds change even what plants can grow, even what trees can grow. And third, earthworms change how the soil interacts with water. Now to the point. There's a reason that we use earthworms for bait. First, fish, including some salmon and trout, readily eat earthworms when they're available. Earthworms can make up an important part of young salmonid diet. Salmonid, I've heard you say. I'm not a fish expert. Salmonid diet, when and where the two of them end up in the same water. So they can be important to salmon. But the overwhelming majority of earthworms will stay on land. They'll not end up in the water. On land, we know that worms change erosion, runoff, and how water gets into the soil. But we've not really figured out what this means for streams and fish. But look at it this way. This is the Matanuska River Valley, taken from off of Wolverine Road, just this fall when I was hunting. If non-native earthworms were spread over this landscape, where they're mostly absent now, they would flourish. In this hardwood-dominated forest, changing the soil and changing the hydrology and even what plants might grow there. Some of the worms would at times end up in the streams where young salmon would eat them. But compare the vast area of the whole watershed to the area right around streams. Whatever the worms do in the forest has to matter. I just cannot tell you exactly how. In the end, I agree with W. Percy Wickett that, quote, there is every likelihood of earthworms changing the biological nature of streams indirectly through long-term changes in the land. And I have to say that I'm sorry that I cannot tell you what these changes to streams will be, but that is the state of the science. We mostly know about what earthworms do on land. Now, this has not been my work only. It would be wrong of me not to acknowledge some of the others who have researched earthworms in Alaska. I should have acknowledged Tyler Bowman also, who worked with Adrian Wackett and Kyung-Soo Yu, looking at earthworm ecology here. And if any of you want to dig further, I did provide my sources here for that purpose. And thank you. Thanks for listening.
Thanks a lot, Matt. It's scary. It's such a slow moving threat, but I agree. Those pictures of the understory is definitely concerning. It's a lot of change.
Yes, once you've seen it, you'll recognize it.
Yeah, I bet. It looks like we have one question currently. This is amazing, new to me. Nice talk and liked the poem. There are a number of folks thanking you for the poem, by the way. You probably missed in the chat while you were talking. Regarding the photo of the perched roots, how do you know erosion was not the cause rather than earthworms?
Well, that Well, that wasn't a place where erosion was happening. Really, it's not a there's not a big slope there or anything. It's just an aspen stand. And if you walk a little bit through the woods nearby, you'll see the same kinds of woods that look much different. The forest floor is covered in leaf litter, and under that humus, slowly decomposing leaf litter. So in that case, it wasn't erosion.
Yeah, that makes sense. And Bruce Wright just has a comment that gulls that nest at nearby lakes readily feed on earthworms, maybe driving a higher productivity of gulls. So maybe one of the changes we might see in the ecosystem.
Oh, sure. Yeah, so I didn't go into, and that's a terrestrial talk in that. So we actually know quite a bit about. I hadn't heard about gulls, so that thank you. But there are winners and losers of earthworms showing up on land, including animals. So robins are one of the obvious benefactors, and other thrushes and other animals that eat worms. So it's not always as obvious as it seems, because sometimes the worms take away the habitat that those predators live in. So it's not always straightforward. But yes, there are big changes for the terrestrial system, including animals.
Yeah, I bet. There's lots of questions. Emily Hale from Cookville Aquaculture asks, how do you survey for worms in an area?
Sure. We've got let's see if I can get back to my, yes, I can. Okay. So this is our main survey method that we mostly use. There are more, but we use mustard powder. So it's just the regular yellow mustard powder, spice off the spice rack. We buy it in bulk. You mix about 4 tablespoons, 30 grams with a gallon of water, a little bit of a headspace, shake it up, pour it over the soil. After you remove the leaf litter, it will seep into the soil and the worms come up.
Wow.
It works quite well.
Interesting. Okay. Then I'm going to jump around a little bit, and I'm sorry I won't be able to get to everybody's questions right now, it looks like, because we're need to move on to our next presenter soon. But let's see. And Andy from Cookville Aquaculture asked what control mechanisms are they can use for invasive worms.
Well, there is no approved method. So we know from kind of the other side of things. So in agriculture, pesticides are often applied to control lots of things, insects, fungi, and some of those chemicals are very effective at killing earthworms, but there are none that are approved for that in the United States. There are no pesticides approved for that purpose. There's no non-chemical way. There are some plant-derived toxins that work, but that's all pretty researchy. And we're unique in that in the lower 48, worms are already everywhere, most places. So it wouldn't make any sense to try to completely eradicate them. So it's golf courses that are looking at reducing worm casts. We're in a different situation where we have a landscape where the only thing we'd be really interested is completely eradicating them from a small area, but that would be new research.
Okay. Interesting. Well, thank you so much. And if you can take a look at the chat, there looks like there's some other questions you might be able to reach out
Sure.
for, but yeah, thanks again.